Welcome to the virtual field trip for Keewaydin. If you're watching this, you are either in one of my online courses or you missed the field trip. And so you have to take the field trip online. So this is the online version of the Keewaydin field trip that I've been taking my Geo 110 students on for a long time. So where is Keewaydin? Keewaydin is a park in our Thousand Islands region. It's just outside of Alexandria Bay. So it's about 30 miles north of Watertown. Watertown is where Jefferson Community College is located. So if you take 81 north, it's on basically the last off ramp before you get to Canada. And it does sit along the St. Lawrence. There is a DEC Resource Center housed there. So if you ever go up there, you will see the DEC building and happy DEC workers going in and out. But they basically sit in the middle of the park. Now, if you've ever been to Pirate Days in the Bay, you're probably pretty familiar with Keewaydin. Some kinds of rowdy partying apparently goes on there in the summer. I, of course, as a professor, would know nothing about such things. But it's also a very beautiful park, and you can see something on the order of 2 to 3 billion years of Earth's history over a couple of acres of land. So it's a really astonishing site geologically. So in this photo, you can see two of my friends. They accompanied along to take photos of this field trip. That's Bethany, who is the redhead, and Crystal, who is the brunette. And they helped me explore and take pictures as we went along. So in this picture, this is what you will, if you pull into the parking lot, this is what you'll first see is this beautiful gazebo. The gazebo is this building with points on the top of it, and that gazebo is made of local bedrock. So before we go any further, it's important for you to really have in your head what we mean when we say bedrock. We've used that term inside the class a couple of times. I want to make sure that you really understand it. So the bedrock is rock that is actually attached to the crust. No matter how far down you dig, you cannot like pick up a piece of bedrock because it's literally attached to earth itself. Underneath all sediment that you see, if you dig down far enough, you will eventually find bedrock. Bedrock can be made of any of the three major rock types, sedimentary, igneous, or metamorphic. But the important thing is that it's attached to the crust. If it's not attached to the crust, in other words, you can pick up a chunk. That loose chunk is usually called regolith or sediment, depending on the context. So what we're seeing here in this rock, so we're right next to the St. Lawrence River, and what we're seeing is a lot of granite and a lot of gneiss. So thinking back to our rocks lab, what kind of rock is granite and what kind of rock is gneiss? And I'll kind of do a Dora the Explorer thing as you try to remember. What kind of rock is granite and what kind of rock is gneiss? That's right, I'm assuming that you guessed correctly. Well, that guessed, that granite is an igneous rock and gneiss is a metamorphic rock. And for this conversation, it's important to remember that granite is a felsic, intrusive, igneous rock, and gneiss is a foliated, high-grade, metamorphic rock. Now, if you actually go up there, one of the things you're going to see is that the rocks are covered with two very different kinds of substances. The soft, fuzzy stuff, that's moss, that's a plant. And most people can recognize moss and know what that is. But a lot of people think, you see it in the top photo, that gray material is somehow part of the rock. It's not. It's actually what's called lichen. Lichen is a symbiotic organism. It's a symbiosis between a photosynthesizing plant and a fungus. Um, and we don't know how old that symbiosis is, but some scientists theorize that it's basically one of the first organisms to colonize land. But it looks a lot like the rock itself. It's actually not part of it. Now you also see some long scratches on the rock. Those long scratches, particularly in the top photo where you see one long scratch, almost looks like a little bit like a butt crack that's running this way across the rock, and another one that's running that way across the rock. Uh, those are what's called glacial striations. So those glacial striations were caused by the glaciers moving over the rock. So glaciers are not clean ice. They're not like the ice from your refrigerator or freezer. They are dirty, dirty, dirty giant blocks of rock, blocks of ice that are mixed with rock and dirt and a whole bunch of other things. So as those heavy 2 mile thick blocks of ice covered with dirt and debris and with boulders embedded in the bottom of them slowly drag over the land, those boulders, those rough things underneath them, scratch the underlying rock. And that's what we see a lot of in Keewaydin are these striations. You can also see some in the bottom photo. There's a striation running this way as well that's got moss growing in the crack of it. Um, Now the granite is from the formation of the continents. So it's more than 2.5 billion years old. That's billion with a B. So that's 2,500 million years ago. So it's the granite that you're seeing there is older than the 10 times older than the oldest dinosaur. So just to give you, and probably about 30 times older than T-Rex. 30 times older than Tyrannosaurus Rex. So if Tyrannosaurus Rex is 1 year old, then this granite is 30 years old. So that gives you kind of a perspective of how old it is in Earth time. So this granite that you see here is actually bedrock, and it's attached, not only attached to the crust, it is the continental crust itself that you're seeing. So that continental crust was exposed by glaciers, and that formed about 2.5 billion years ago during the late stages of Earth formation. So Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago, and at first it was kind of molten and gooey. Then the outer layer of it began to cool off, and it formed its early crust was very much like oceanic crust. And there were tons of little tiny plate boundaries all over the place. So you constantly had collisions, you had subduction, you had divergent plate boundary, you had transform, and it was all over the place. So at these early convergent plate boundaries, what would happen is that you would have the subduction of this rather mafic material that would partially melt, and then the resulting volcano would be just a little bit more felsic. Now, those volcanoes, island arcs, would collide into each other, make larger masses, and then themselves would also get subducted and become a little bit more felsic. Over time, the Earth evolved, and the continents turned out to be much more felsic than the original material. So that granite, that's why the granite is felsic. Now, it's also intrusive, which might be a little bit confusing because you might be saying to yourself, yeah, but volcanoes, shouldn't it be extrusive? Or you're thinking like, Dr. E, I did not think that far into it. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, if you're thinking hard about it, you think to yourself, wow, that probably should be extrusive. That's the outer layer. But we don't see the very most outer layer that first cooled. What we see is deeper rock that's been exposed. That outer layer of extrusive felsic igneous rock called rhyolite eventually became eroded, and what we see is the underlying felsic igneous rock, granite. And we'll get into the formation of gneiss when we get to the next stop on the field trip. So at this first stop, if you go down closer to the river, so we were standing right on the river. If you stood in that gazebo, you would basically have the breeze coming off the river in your face. But there's a kind of a cliff And if you walk down that cliff and take a look at the rocks down there, what you see is a lot of different kinds of weathering. So that granite has been broken apart, and you can see how active weathering is taking place. You see some frost wedging, evidence of frost wedging, so these boulders that have been split in two by water entering the cracks and freezing. You see root wedging actively going on. Like in this picture in particular, you see plants growing inside the cracks. As those plants swell with water, it creates an osmotic pressure that is surprisingly strong, strong enough to shatter granite. And then a very important process in this area is unloading. So this granite was, even though it's 2.5 billion years old, it was exposed by the glaciers. And that glaciation ended about 11,500 years ago, which is a blink of the eye in Earth terms. In Earth terms, 11,000 years ago, even in human terms, I mean, that's not that long ago, okay? The oldest pyramids are about half that age. Okay, so I mean we're talking about something that's happening like really recently. So the rocks are still adapting to the new stresses of being exposed, of being at the surface of the earth. So because they no longer have that confining pressure on them, they expand, and that leads to cracks. And cracks are joints. They're not this kind of joint. They are a vertical or horizontal crack that is created that doesn't have any evidence of displacement. So that's where you see these cracks in here. So the next stop is really only a couple hundred feet from the first stop. So if you leave the gazebo, what we see was this big mound. You can actually see the gazebo in the distance in this shot. Where of exposed bedrock. And this bedrock is made of the same rock that we see at the first spot, except it's a lot richer in gneiss. So this is the rock near the parking lots. And remember, what kind of rock is gneiss? That's right. It's metamorphic, and it's not just metamorphic, it is a high grade foliated metamorphic rock. So gneiss contains a lot of silica-rich minerals. Those lighter bands are containing mostly quartz and feldspar. The darker bands contain biotite, which is also a very silica-rich rock. If you take Geo 131, you'll learn about Bowen's reaction series, and most of these are at that really low temperature felsic portion of the Bowen's reaction series. And you also see hornblende. And hornblende is important because hornblende forms in very narrow environments. What you need for hornblende to form is this really wet, hot, high pressure, high stress environment. Where are we going to see that? Where we're really going to see that is in collisions and subductions. So we're going to see that in subduction zones and in collisions where we have these massive convergent plate boundaries. Now you see these foliated bands, and these foliations tell you the direction of the forces that formed it. So I've highlighted a foliation. I've put basically little brackets in that picture, and you can see the direction of the arrows, and those arrows show the direction of the forces. So what formed this rock in here? What's formed this gneiss that you see here? So when you're seeing the gneiss up in Alexandria Bay, what you're looking at is the inside of a mountain. If you could go to the Himalayas and take an axe and cut the Himalayas down all the way down to the ground and pull back that rock, this is what you would see underneath it. Okay? In A Bay, about 1.1 billion years ago, once again, that's billion with a B, so 1,100 million years ago, what we saw were mountains bigger than the Himalayas, much bigger than the Himalayas. And those mountains formed through a massive continental collision forming a supercontinent known as Rodinia. Okay, so Rodinia, um, um, Rodinia was a massive supercontinent. It was a collision very similar to what we see between the Indian subcontinents and the Asian subcontinent today. Um, and so what this nice formed under was under when basically Europe and Africa, one of the many times Europe and Africa has slammed into us, when they slammed into us about 1.1 billion years ago. This is before there were any dinosaurs. This is before there was any fish or life was single celled. It was it was it was really a single-celled, simple life forms only environment, and you have these massive, massive continents forming. Now, what happened to these huge mountain ranges in Alexandria Bay? You go up to Alexandria Bay now and you look around, and there's no Himalayas. And the reason for that is over the past 1.1 billion years, a lot of erosion, a lot of weathering. And that has taken those mountains down to the flat plains that we see today up in um, Alexandria Bay. So we're next going to go ahead and imagine ourselves like walking through the park, and then we go to the outside of the park, just on the edge of the park. And we walk along the road cut. And if you do this kind of on your own, if you want to explore Alexandria Bay on your own or want to explore Keewaydin on your own, my number one advice is be careful. Be careful of two things. Number one is be careful of traffic. Don't tell someone, like, go get hit by a car and be like, but my geology professor told me that this would be a fun field trip to go on my own. No, it's not my fault. Watch out for cars. People drive like idiots along the highway. The other thing is there's a plant called the poison parsnip, and it's relatively harmless, but don't go picking things and rubbing your eyes, okay? Don't go touching a bunch of random plants. At, at the time of year that we did this, took these photos, this was in the early spring. This is a great time to do this because the plants really haven't grown up and you don't really have to worry about things like poison parsnip. But don't go picking things and then rubbing them all over your skin because you're going to have a bad day. So those are two plants. It's not something to be like, it's not like the plant from Mario Brothers where it's going to eat you. Okay, it's not that dangerous, but it will lead to a bad day. The traffic, on the other hand, is in fact that dangerous. So keep an eye out. So let's talk about what we see along this road cut along the highway. So one of the first rocks you're going to notice, so you're going to see a lot of the same granite. And remember that granite is an igneous intrusive rock. The other rock that you're going to see is that gneiss, and that is that high grade metamorphic rock. So we talked about how the granite formed, we talked about how the gneiss formed. Let's talk about how the basalt formed. So we see this basalt all along the edge here, and it's actually it's in a glacial trough. There's like a teeny tiny glacial crowd that's been carved, and you see it really clearly because the basalt is a lot softer than a lot of the surrounding bedrock. So the glacier cut more deeply into it. So you see this nice, neat little trout. Um, and what we see in this basalt is what kind of rock? That's right. It is igneous. It is an igneous, it's an aphanitic, fine-grained, mafic igneous rock. It formed through volcanic processes. And we see a big long band in a formation called a dike, which is a long, flat, vertical igneous intrusion. And this particular basalt formed sometime after Rodinia, but before the Cambrian sandstone that we see. So sometime between 1 billion and 500 million years ago. And where did it come from? This So think back to Rodinia. Does Rodinia exist today? Can I take a nice little walk from Watertown to Africa? No, I cannot. I cannot go to Lagos this way. Okay, Lagos in Nigeria by just taking a nice little stroll or driving my car. There's a big old ocean in between us. So what happened to Rodinia was that Rodinia broke up. Like many bands of the 90s. No, Rodinia broke up and pulled itself apart. So this is evidence we see here of that continental rifting that we talked about, where we have the continent pulling apart, and we have that volcanic activity as that molten material. There's a once again, this is more of a Geo 131 concept, but it's still pretty cool. So as you get that thinning of the lithosphere, as it's gradually pulling apart, almost a little bit like brittle taffy with cracks. So as those cracks form, you have this unloading on hot rock underneath it because you have a decrease in pressure of that deeper material. It melts and it comes up inside those cracks, and it creates those long vertical, why, like they're long and straight and vertical igneous intrusions that we call dikes. And there might be an interesting connection between the faulting that we see from that Rodinia breakup and some recent events. So I don't know if anybody remembers the earthquake swarms that hit our area back in 2023. So Adams, New York, for years I've told people, oh, there's not earthquakes in upstate New York. We don't have a bunch of plate boundaries. We don't see a lot of earthquakes. I got an email from a student going like, I thought there weren't earthquakes here. Well, everyone was surprised. USGS was surprised. What's going on with these earthquakes? So the earthquakes may have been formed by the leftover faulting from the breakup of Rodinia sometime around 800 to 600 million years ago, sometime in that time period. Okay. Now, if you look at the basalt is about 14% iron by weight. And we can tell that by looking at that image of basalt. What does it look like? It's orange, right? It looks like your brother's busted car, or at least my cousin. My cousin has a busted car, and my cousin's busted car has spots of that. And that is rust. That is oxidation. That is the type of weathering that we see on this basalt because it's incredibly rich in iron, so it weathers incredibly. It's very responsive to oxidation. And now you know that my cousin has a broken down old car. So, basalt. The basalt also has that, as I mentioned, that glacial trough. So once again, we've got layers upon layer. Like I sometimes, you know, students don't always get this, but it's a little bit like a palimpsest. Okay, these documents that were written by monks in the Middle Ages, where what they did was they took paper from the classical era, from the Romans and the Greeks. Well, not paper, but they took um, ask a historian, the leathery one, and they would actually like erase it, and then they would write on it, and then they would erase it again, and then they would write on it again. And so what you would see, especially if you put like a black light on it, is all these layers of different writing that are on the same piece of paper from all these different ages. That's what rocks are like. They have all these layers, all these histories. No rock has one story. Every rocks are like people. And just like people have multiple stories layered on them, like why do they do it? Like why are they like that? They are like that for all the reasons that are layered up. Why is that rock like that? All the reasons layered up. So this basalt that formed sometime between probably in the neighborhood of around 800 to 600 million years ago was further modified by those Pleistocene glaciations between 2.5 million and 11,000 years ago. So really, really recently in geologic terms, this glacial trough was carved into this truly, truly ancient basalt. But wait, there's more. We also see this lovely sandstone, and my friend Crystal poking it with a stick. So, so this is the sandstone that is along that rock cut that's just above the basalt and the gneiss and the granite. And it's this beautiful orange. It's known as the formation is the Potsdam sandstone. It's a very valuable, not this particular section of it, but it's a very valuable building material. It's used in facades because it can come in such lovely colors. It's iron rich, so it tends to be like this rich, orange or red, and it can have like these beautiful streaks in it. So it's very often used in building and in facades and in like kitchens and things like that because it is so pretty. So it's a pretty valuable regional resource. Um, and we see this sandstone. Now, when I, as a geologist, see sandstone, I think one thing, and that is a beach. That is an evidence of an ancient beach. That's another layer of story here. About 500 million years ago, this is when life started getting exciting. The early Cambrian, when we start having this burst in evolution known as the Cambrian explosion, we start seeing things that can crawl, that can walk, that can poop, and that's a huge thing, the evolution of pooping. A third of my PhD thesis was on feces because pooping changed the world. It really did. Um, but you have these organisms that are doing complex things. They're not single-celled organisms or these little tiny clusters of organisms. We're not paying attention to the Edicarians. I can tell you about those another time. Those are really freaky things. Nobody knows what those things are, but they're weird. These are things you would recognize, things that look like beetles, things that look like bugs, things that look like clams, things that look like mussels. Okay, so things that you could actually look at that and be like, that is a fossil of a thing that I kind of recognize, or at least a distant relative of that. So this sand was deposited on this ancient beach. And it has also been oxidized, which is why it is that beautiful orange red color. Now, the most amazing thing in this area is this great mystery that is represented by that red line that I've used to demark between the nice basalt granite unit and the sandstone that's sitting up above it. And what that is called an unconformity. An unconformity is a gap in the rock record that represents a gap in time. This represents 500 million years of missing rock. There are 500 million years. We don't know what happened. It's like Earth went on a bender and had a blackout. We don't know. And it's not just in Alexandria Bay where this is missing. This is a global phenomenon. This is known as the Great Unconformity. You can see it in South Africa. You can see it in the Grand Canyon. Anywhere you go on Earth, you're going to see this section of missing rock. And it's very unfortunate for paleontologists and geologists because this is when the world got interesting. This is when oxygen really started to spike. This is when animals really started to diversify. And all that information is gone. What destroyed it? So one theory is the breakup of Virginius destroyed it. I'm going to be honest, I did work on this stuff in my PhD. I don't 100% buy that because to me, it's a really elaborate explanation for why that rock got destroyed. I tend to support the idea that snowball Earth, and it's an older concept that snowball Earth destroyed it. I think it's going to make a resurgence right now because glaciers are agents of destruction. Okay, and the reason for that is you're talking about 2, 3, and in the case of snowball Earth, 4 and bigger mile thick walls of ice, you know, hundreds and hundreds of millions of tons of ice, oceans of ice, massive, that have boulders embedded in the bottom of it, that huge ice pressing down on it and scratching across the earth. You basically just gave Earth a facial. You just sanded off the outer layers of the earth entirely. So what snowball Earth was this time period sometime between 800 and 600 million years ago, and it's not a single glaciation event. It's more than that. We're sure there's at least 3 separate events where the Earth became completely frozen over with glaciers. Okay, the Pleistocene glaciations, those were big. but those still only covered about a third of Earth's surface. These covered 100% of Earth's surface and the majority of the oceans. We don't even know exactly how life survived this. We basically became like the moon Europa, okay, the moon of Jupiter Europa, just totally frozen over. And those huge glaciers really caused a lot of damage in their wake. So once again, we have this evidence of layer of story upon layer of story upon layer of story. So in this case, in this site, we see evidence of two glaciations, one that ended only 11,000 years ago, and the other one that happened about 800 million years ago, totally separated in time. One had mastodons, the other one only had single-celled organisms. No dinosaurs, no trilobites, no shelly anything, no fossil fish, no coelacanth, none of that. Nothing. Just single-celled organisms. And it just crushed the earth. And that's not the only time we've had snowball Earth. We actually had an earlier event than that during the Archean, but that's another story because we don't have any Archean rock available here in Keewaydin. But that gives you a history of Keewaydin. I've dropped the little tidbits of the story through this video, so when you write the wrap up, you're basically, one of the big goals of the wrap up is to summarize all of these points that I have brought up about the history of the earth, because that's what we're really seeing here is this history of the earth in local bedrock. So thank you so much for paying attention. I hope you at least enjoyed a little bit of your field trip. I hope you take a trip up to Abay. If you go along the rock cut, once again, be careful because it's dangerous. And thanks for paying attention. Thanks for being my student.